Under the burning skies of the Arizona frontier, where the wind carried dust and secrets alike, my life changed forever. I was only 18 when my father sold me to the Apache king. I still remember the way his trembling hands refused to meet my eyes, the guilt hidden beneath his silence, and the echo of horses snorting as the tribal riders approached our ranch. I was terrified, but in that terror, my story began one I never imagined would lead me to love a man feared by all. A man the settlers called a savage, and the desert called a legend. Our family had lost nearly everything by that year. The cattle had died during the drought, and our well had turned to dust. My father, once a proud man with a rifle slung across his back, had grown hollow, his eyes carrying the weight of debts that no prayer could pay. When the Apache came down from the hills, demanding retribution for a deal gone wrong between the traders and the tribes, I thought it would be the end of us. Instead, they took me as the price for peace. My father's voice cracked as he told them to take me, his only daughter. That night, as the tribe's torches vanished into the darkness, my heart shattered against the rhythm of their drums. The Apache king rode ahead of them, his figure striking even under the moonlight. He was tall, his long dark hair flowing like the wind itself, his face carved with the strength of someone who had lived and ruled through both blood and fire. He spoke little, but his gaze was fierce, and every word he did speak carried the weight of command. To his people, he was a protector. To my kind, he was a threat. Yet as I sat behind him on his horse, clutching the saddle with trembling hands, I could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath me, strong and unyielding. I hated him for what he represented, but something in his silence kept me from looking away. Days passed as we traveled through endless deserts and jagged canyons. The sun burned my skin, the nights froze my bones, and I dreamed of home, even though I no longer had one. I watched the tribe live, how the women laughed around fires, how the warriors hunted with precision, how even the children carried the pride of their ancestors. I didn't understand their words, but I understood their spirit. And though I fought against it, a small part of me began to see that this was a world where life burned raw and real. When we reached their camp, Apache King dismounted and turned to me. He didn't drag me or raise his voice. He simply looked at me, his eyes dark as the canyon at night, and gestured toward a tent made of buffalo hide. "You will stay here," he said, his accent thick, but his tone calm. I wanted to scream at him to demand why my life had been traded like a piece of land, but my voice failed me. Inside the tent, I found a blanket, a clay pot of water, and a small fire flickering weakly. Fear gripped me, but so did curiosity. Why was a man of war showing me mercy? The nights were the hardest. I could hear distant drumming, chants rising into the stars, and the sound of wolves howling beyond the hills. I often thought of escaping, but the vastness of the desert mocked me. Still, every dawn I stood outside and watched the tribe awaken. The Apache king would ride out at first light, leading his men with quiet authority. He never looked at me, but I always knew when he was near the camp grew still, as if the wind itself bowed to him. And though I told myself I despised him, my eyes followed him without my permission. One evening, a storm rolled in from the south, wild and merciless. The wind tore through the camp, sending tents flying and fires dying. I had been fetching water when the storm hit, and by the time I stumbled back, rain soaked my dress and hair. The horses cried out, and I tripped in the mud. Before I could rise, strong hands lifted me, and I found myself staring into the same eyes I had tried so hard to hate. The Apache king carried me back to the tent, his jaw tense, his chest heaving from the rain. He didn't speak. He just covered me with a blanket and turned away, his hair dripping down his back. I whispered, "Thank you," but he didn't answer. Yet in that silence, something between us changed. The storm outside raged, but inside the tent, my heart was louder. The days that followed blurred into strange calmness. He began to teach me their words, names of animals, the sun, the rain. His patience surprised me. His people respected him not just out of fear, but out of devotion. When he laughed, which was rare, it was deep and honest. Once, I caught him watching me as I fed a stray colt near the camp. Our eyes met, and for the first time, I didn't look away. I couldn't tell if it was kindness or danger in his gaze. Maybe it was both still. I couldn't forget what had brought me there. Every time I thought I understood him, I remembered the way my father's hand shook as he gave me away. Some nights I'd sit by the fire wondering if he missed me or if guilt had already buried him. The Apache King noticed my distance, though I never spoke of my past. One night he sat beside me and said, "Your eyes carry storms. You fight what is gone." His words startled me. How could a man like him understand loss? Yet, in his quiet way, he did. I could see it in the scars that crossed his hands, and the way his gaze sometimes lingered on the horizon, as if he too had once lost something he loved. There was a night when everything changed again. A rival tribe attacked near dawn, their arrows slicing through the stillness. The Apache warriors rose with fierce cries, and chaos tore through the camp. I hid behind the tent, heart pounding, when a burning arrow struck close. The flames spread fast, the smoke choking the air. I was trapped until he appeared, his arm around me, dragging me out through the fire. He fought with the fury of a storm, his blade flashing in the firelight, and though fear consumed me, I couldn't look away. He saved not only me, but his people, commanding the defense until the raiders fled. When the sun rose, the camp was scarred, but safe. And as he stood before me, blood on his arm and ash in his hair, I realized something deep within me had shifted. The man I once called my captor had become the one who had risked his life to protect mine. But love is a strange thing. It grows quietly, like roots beneath the desert sand. I didn't know it yet, but the same fear that once bound me to him was slowly turning into something else, something I couldn't name. He was still the Apache King, proud and distant, and I was still the outsider who had been traded away. Yet every time he passed by, every time his voice broke the silence of the desert, my heart answered. I didn't understand it, and maybe I didn't want to. Because deep down, I knew that what began in fear could never end easily. The camp whispered about us, and I could feel eyes watching wherever I went. Some said I brought him bad luck. Others said I was chosen by their spirits. I didn't know which was worse. All I knew was that the man I was supposed to hate had become the only one I trusted. But in the wild lands of the frontier, peace never lasted long. Riders from the north were seen again, the same ones who sought to destroy his tribe. And when their war cries echoed across the valley one fateful night, I found myself standing beside him, trembling but unyielding, knowing that whatever happened next would change both our lives forever. The days that followed that night of fire and battle left the camp wounded but unbroken. Smoke still lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of wet earth and ashes. The Apache King moved among his people, silent but steady, tending to those who were hurt, rebuilding what was lost. I watched from a distance, my hands trembling as I helped the women fetch water and bind wounds. It was strange how I, once the frightened girl sold into their world, now felt a pull to protect it. Each life I saw saved made me see the tribe not as enemies, but as people bound together by something far stronger than the fear I'd known. Yet deep inside, that fear was still there, quiet but alive, whispering that my place among them was borrowed time. The Apache King spoke rarely, but his presence filled every silence. There was a calmness about him that unsettled me. He had seen death and fire, yet carried himself as though nothing could shake him. When he passed near me, the air seemed to change. I could not tell if it was the weight of his power or the mystery that surrounded him, but I found it hard to breathe. I wanted to understand who he was beyond the title of king, beyond the scars on his hands and the command in his voice. I wondered what kind of man could carry so much burden and still look at the horizon as if the world was still worth fighting for. The older women told stories around the fire each night. They said he was born during a thunderstorm, that the spirits marked him with strength. They said he had once loved a woman from another tribe, but she was taken from him during a raid, and since then, he had never looked at another with the same heart. I didn't know if the story was true, but it lingered in my thoughts. Sometimes when he stared into the distance, I could almost see the weight of loss behind his eyes. That sadness made him human, and it scared me even more because it made me feel closer to him. I tried to keep my distance. I reminded myself every day that I was here because my father had traded me, not because I had chosen it. But the more I lived among the Apache, the harder it became to separate fear from understanding. The women had taken me in, teaching me how to grind maize, how to weave simple cloth, how to listen to the wind and predict rain. Their laughter was pure, their kindness real. I had never known women like them in the settlements, where gossip and greed often lived behind smiles. These women had lost brothers and sons, yet still found a way to sing while cooking over fires. Their strength softened something inside me. At night, the desert grew quiet, and the stars stretched endlessly above. I would sit near the edge of the camp, wrapping the blanket tightly around my shoulders. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps behind me, slow and certain. I wouldn't need to turn to know it was him. He would stand near, silent for long moments, watching the sky as I did. One night he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You still dream of the place you came from?" His words weren't a question, yet I nodded. He continued, "Your people live behind fences and fear what they do not understand. The desert has no fences. It teaches you to be strong, or it takes you." His tone wasn't cruel. It was truth, spoken like the wind cutting across the dunes. I didn't answer him that night. But I thought about his words long after he walked away. Maybe that was what made the Apache different. They didn't run from pain. They lived through it, learned from it, carried it like armor. In my world, people buried pain under pride. Here they faced it beneath the open sky. I began to see how my father's weakness had cost us everything. He had sold his daughter to survive. But these people survived without trading their souls. Days turned to weeks, and life slowly returned to the camp. Children played again. The drums at night became lighter, the songs of healing rising through the wind. Yet beneath the surface, tension still burned. Scouts returned with news that the northern raiders were gathering again, and the Apache king's eyes grew darker with every report. The tribe prepared quietly. Spears were sharpened, horses trained. I watched them from the edge, my heart heavy with unease. I wasn't one of them, but if danger came again, I knew I would not run. Something had rooted me here, something I didn't yet understand. One afternoon, while helping gather herbs near the river, I saw him standing on the ridge above. He was alone, his bow slung across his back, the wind tugging at his hair. The sun cast gold across his skin, and for a moment, he looked almost carved from the earth itself. When he noticed me, he motioned for me to come closer. I hesitated, but curiosity drew me in. As I climbed the slope, he said, "You are not weak like I thought." I frowned, unsure how to take his words. "You were afraid," he added, "but you did not break." Something in me wanted to argue, to tell him I was still afraid every day. But his eyes held a quiet understanding, and I couldn't speak. He pointed toward the valley below, where a herd of wild horses ran freely. "They belong to no one," he said. "They run because the wind calls them. You were like that horse at first, frightened of the sound of your own heart. But soon, the wind becomes your friend." His words were strange, but comforting. For the first time, I felt seen. As days passed, his words began to echo in everything I did. I worked harder, learned faster, and even laughed with the children. Yet the nights brought back the same dreams, the sound of my father's voice, the guilt that clung to me. I woke often before dawn, walking alone toward the river. The Apache king must have noticed, because one morning he followed quietly and asked, "Why do you carry sadness that is not yours?" I told him I didn't know. Maybe because I felt abandoned. Maybe because I had never been given a choice. He nodded slowly, then said, "The desert gives choices. It only asks that you listen." I didn't understand what he meant until one evening when a messenger came from another tribe. The man brought news that the raiders were moving south, burning settlements, taking what they could. The Apache king gathered his warriors, his face calm but fierce. When I heard, my chest tightened with fear. I realized then that I wasn't just afraid for myself anymore. I was afraid for him. I wanted to tell him not to go, but I knew I couldn't. This was his duty, and I had no right to stop him. Still, before he rode out, he stopped by my tent. He didn't speak at first, only handed me a small carved token made of bone. "Keep this," he said. It will remind you that the wind always returns." His eyes lingered on mine for a heartbeat longer than usual before he turned away. When the warriors disappeared into the horizon, the camp fell into uneasy silence. The women prayed, the fires burned low, and every gust of wind felt like an omen. Nights stretched longer, and the sound of the coyotes made the children cry. I tried to stay busy helping with the elders, fetching water, but every shadow made my heart race. Days later, a small group of wounded riders returned. The raid had been fierce. Many had fallen. I searched their faces, my throat dry, but he wasn't among them. No one spoke, but the fear was heavy. I sat by the fire that night, clutching the bone token so tightly it left a mark on my palm. My mind replayed every moment with him, the storm, the silence, the way his words lingered like the desert wind. I didn't want to believe he was gone. Something inside me refused to. The same wind that had carried him away would bring him back. It had to. The next morning, I stood by the edge of the camp, the sun rising behind the red cliffs. The air was still, heavy with waiting. Then faintly, I heard the distant sound of hooves. One rider appeared on the ridge, then another. My breath caught as I saw him among them, weary but alive, his body marked by battle, his eyes still burning with life. Relief washed over me, but with it came a new truth. The fear that had once chained me was no longer fear at all. It was something far deeper, something I wasn't ready to name. And in that moment, as the wind carried the sound of drums once again through the valley, I knew the story between us had only just begun. When he returned from the raid, the camp breathed again, yet the calm felt thin, like a skin stretched across a boiling pot. He moved with care, speaking softly to his lieutenants and checking on the wounded. I watched the way the others looked at him, a mix of trust and fear, and I felt that familiar pull in my chest. He had a cut on his shoulder wrapped in clean cloth. When I brought water, he thanked me with a quiet nod. I caught the tired line near his mouth, the kind that forms when a person carries more weight than he lets others see. He did not stay to rest. Before noon, he was walking the perimeter, eyes on the ridges, as if expecting the earth to rise against him. That evening, the elders met around a low fire. I stayed near the edge, pretending to mend a torn blanket. The talk turned toward the northern raiders and the traitors who armed them. A lean older man said they were pushed by promises from a settlement far to the east. Another elder spoke of a shadow figure who wore a hat with a silver band and paid in hard coin for stolen cattle and stolen people. The Apache king said little, but when he did speak, his words landed like arrows. He wanted proof. He wanted names. He wanted to know who was stirring hate and profit in the same pot, because it was not just the tribe at risk. The whole frontier was growing hot. From the river in the south to the big pines in the north, I could not help thinking of my father then. If there were traitors who bought misery with shiny coins, what kind of deal had pushed him to hand me over? Debt was a heavy shackle. I had seen it break a man's pride before. But now I began to suspect it was not only the drought that had ruined us. There were men who profited from fear. Maybe they had stood at our door with friendly smiles. Maybe they had shaken my father's hand and called him friend while taking his land one paper at a time. In the days that followed, scouts rode out in different directions. A young rider named Pine, light on his feet and fast with a grin, often came to the cooking area where I worked with the women. He would share a joke with the children and steal a hot piece of fry bread when he thought no one was looking. Once, he told me in a low voice that he had seen smoke near the old ravine where the river once ran. Not camp smoke, forge smoke, the kind that came from heating metal. I felt a chill. Out here, men did not set up a forge for simple reasons. They set it up to shape tools for hunting or to shape weapons for raiding. The Apache king listened to the report without a twitch, then sent Pine out again with another rider. While the men tracked trouble, the women quietly prepared for it. They taught me how to pack a horse fast and how to hide food in the earth where no one could find it. One elder showed me a narrow path through the reeds by the riverbed that led to a cave cool as a mountain room. For children and those who cannot fight, she said. Her voice was steady, yet her hands shook at the memory of old attacks. I realized that survival had a routine here. The routine did not make it easy. It only made it possible. A side current moved through the camp, one I could not name at first. A few warriors watched me longer than before. Some kept their eyes down when I passed. A woman my age, who had always been kind, pulled away when our hands almost touched at the washing pool. Later she came to me and whispered that some believed my presence had brought danger, that a girl from the ranch world had no place in the circle of the people. I understood. Fear needs a face to aim at. I did not blame them. I only felt again the hollow ache of being between worlds, claimed by neither. One afternoon an old trader rode in under a white cloth tied to a stick. He was known to the tribe and allowed to speak. He brought beads and blankets, but he also brought news. Settlers to the east were building a tall fence around a freshwater spring they had found near the cottonwoods. The spring had been used by travelers for generations. Now the fence kept others out, unless they paid with cattle or service. The trader also spoke of a preacher who warned against wild tribes in a loud voice and stirred crowds with fear. The Apache king's jaw tightened. He asked the trader many questions and paid him with meat and a simple knife. When the man left, the mood in camp turned grim. Water and fear were the same kind of power out here. Whoever controlled them controlled lives. That night I dreamed of the ranch. I saw my father under the dead cottonwood, his hat in his hands, his eyes begging me to understand. When I woke near dawn, I knew I had to try to find him. I had to know why he did what he did and whether the same men behind the raiders had pushed him. I told this to the Apache king when I met him near the horse corral. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he told me that the valley beyond the Red Ridge was not safe, and that the men who might have tempted my father were the same ones provoking war. "You think going back will fix the cut?" he said. "Sometimes the blade is still in the wound." His words were true, but they did not quiet the ache. He saw it. He finally agreed to send Pine and another rider with me as far as the old river stones, so I could see what remained of the ranch from a safe. He would not let me go alone. On the ride, Pine chatted icily, as if to keep my mind from falling into dark places. He told me about the first Mustang he broke, and about his little sister who wanted to ride faster than the boys. The second rider, older and slower to smile, kept his attention on the hills. When we reached the ridge, we tied the horses and crept through scrub to look down on the valley. My breath caught in my throat. The ranch was still standing, but it was not ours anymore. A group of men had set up a camp around it. They wore long coats even in the heat and kept rifles leaning against the porch rail. A windmill I had never seen before turned near the corral. I saw a new brand on stolen cattle. It was a mark like a crescent with a bar through it. I had seen it once on a paper my father shoved into the stove before it could be signed. Now it burned on living hides. Pine touched my shoulder and pointed north. A wagon pulled by mules approached with a heavy chest in the back. 2 men rode behind it, and one wore a hat with a silver band. I felt my throat close. The elder's story had teeth. We watched as the men unloaded the chest and carried it into the house. The older rider breathed out through his nose, a tiny sound of anger. On the edge of the yard, a boy moved toward the well with a bucket. He looked young, maybe 12, too small for work like this. A man barked at him and the boy jumped. The men laughed. My hands balled into fists. We backed away from the ridge to the horses. On the path home, Pine kept his voice low. He said the men at the ranch matched the tracks near the old forge and near the burned farms they had seen upriver. They were moving like a slow fire, building power, using fences and coin and fear. He said this was more than raiding. It was a plan. Back at the camp, the Apache king listened to Pine's report without moving. When he looked at me, I saw not anger, but a careful measure. He asked if I had seen my father. I told him no. The king nodded once. He sent 2 scouts to shadow the ranch from a distance and told the elders that the spring to the east might be the next place trouble would rise. He refused to rush. He drew lines in the dirt with a stick and spoke of wind, water, and travel. The tribe would move in cycles, never presenting an easy target. He was building a shield made of patience. Another thread tugged at the edge of the camp. A quiet boy named Willow, who had lost his father the year before, began following me as I worked. He didn't say much. He carried my bundles and led me to hidden berries along the riverbed. One afternoon he handed me a small carved figure shaped like a horse. He had made it from a piece of driftwood. I thanked him and put it beside the bone token in my tent. Later that day I found him sitting alone near the horse line, watching the warriors practice. His eyes stayed on the Apache king, who moved with simple grace. I realized the boy was searching for a path, a shape to grow into. The tribe needed hope as much as food and water. The tension grew heavier when a young woman from a friendly band arrived with news. A new rumor was moving through the settlements. It said the Apache were planning to take the spring by force and attack the wagons on the old trail. The rumor made the preacher's words sound true. The woman swore the rumor had started with the man in the hat with the silver band. Fear once again was being shaped like a tool. At dusk, as the sky deepened toward violet, the Apache king walked with me along the dry river stones. He spoke of balance. He said war was not only about blades. It was also about stories. Whoever controls the story of a land controls what people fear and what they are willing to do. The raiders were not simply thieves. They were storytellers with coins for ink. I asked what story we could tell to stop them. He said that truth travels slow in a world where lies ride on wagons. That night, a new drum beat sounded. It was not for celebration. It was for calling in the scouts, for sharpening thought. Around the fire, people spoke of the spring, the ranch, and the trail. A plan formed to send a small party under moonlight to follow the wagons that left the ranch. They would not attack. They would watch and learn who received the stolen goods and who printed the paper that took land from worn hands. He told Pine to lead the group. He told me to stay in camp and keep the women ready to move. His voice left no room for debate. Before Pine left, he smiled and pressed a small strip of cloth into my hand. "For the bone token," he said. "Tie it so you do not lose it." He looked proud and scared in the same breath. The older rider clapped him on the shoulder and they were gone into the silver dark. Sleep did not come. I sat near my tent, the token warm against my skin. The wind shifted and brought the scent of rain far away. Somewhere a coyote called and another answered. I thought of the boy at the ranch, the man with the silver band. My father under the dead cottonwood, and the fenced spring guarded by men who used fear like a gate. I thought of the Apache king and the sadness in his eyes that he hid from his people. He had chosen patience over rage, but patience is not armor. It is a test. Near dawn, hooves sounded on the far slope. A single horse came fast. Rider bent low. It was not Pine. It was the older rider, and his face told the story before his mouth formed the words. He slid from the saddle and reached for the king. He said the wagons had turned toward the fenced spring. He said there were more men than expected, armed and waiting. He said a trap had been laid and sprung. He said Pine had not returned when the moon set. The camp froze. The king's eyes moved like a hawk's, sharp and searching. He did not shout. He called for water for the rider, then sent a messenger to the far ridge to watch the road. He walked to the center of the camp and looked toward the east, where the sun would soon rise. I felt the world narrow around us, as if the desert itself held its breath. He turned toward me for the smallest moment, as if to measure whether I would break. I stood straight, though my knees trembled. The bone token pressed against my heart. He lifted his hand to signal the warriors. The drums started again, low and steady, and the people moved with a quiet speed that comes from long practice. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and distance. Then the messenger on the ridge waved his arms. Another rider was coming hard from the east, alone, swaying in the saddle. The horse stumbled as it reached the flat. The rider slid to the ground and tried to speak. His mouth opened, but the words tangled with breath. He pointed toward the fenced spring and drew a sign in the air that made the elders gasp. I did not know what it meant, but the king did. His face changed, not with fear, but with a cold, clear focus that frightened me more than any shout. We stood there in the rising light, trapped between the need to move and the need to listen, and I understood that the path ahead had split. On one side was the ranch where the men with long coats traded coin for power. On the other side was the spring where the raiders waited, and Pine's fate was a question that burned like a coal. The king raised his hand to speak. The drums fell silent. The rider's next breath finally found its shape. Before he could finish, a gunshot cracked the morning from the ridge behind us, and the echo rolled through the valley like thunder. The gunshot cracked through the morning like a curse, scattering birds into the air. Every warrior in the camp froze for half a breath before reaching for weapons. The Apache king lifted his hands steady and silent, and the entire camp moved as one. The wounded rider on the ground tried to rise, blood spreading across his shirt. His voice was rough, breaking as he forced out the words that would shatter what calm was left. He said the men with the silver-banded hat had found the hidden scouts, that Pine had been taken alive, and that the raiders were using him as bait to draw the Apache toward the fenced spring. The king's eyes narrowed, cold and unreadable. But I saw the pulse, and his neck jumped once hard. He gave quiet orders, his tone calm even as the camp rippled with tension. Warriors prepared their horses, bows, and rifles. Women gathered supplies for the wounded that would come. I helped one of the healers pack herbs and cloth, my hand shaking so badly I dropped a bundle of sage into the dust. The healer placed her weathered hand on mine and whispered, "Do not fear the storm before it arrives. Sometimes it passes faster than thunder, but fear doesn't listen to wisdom. It claws at the chest until it feels like breath won't come." By midday, the Apache king had chosen 20 riders to go with him toward the spring. I knew Pine's chances were slim, yet there was something unspoken in everyone's eyes, the need to bring him home, dead or alive, before the settlers used him to spark a war. I watched as they mounted, the horses restless, the sky heavy with heat. The king glanced once toward me. It wasn't long, barely a heartbeat, but I understood what that look meant. He was walking into danger that might not have a way out, and I couldn't stay behind knowing that when they rode out. I followed from a distance, keeping to the dry gullies and sagebrush, my borrowed horse light and quiet beneath me. The wind carried the dust of their trail ahead. Every sound felt sharper, every mile longer. The horizon shimmered with heat, and the fenced spring came into view like a scar on the land wooden posts. Coils of barbed wire and wagons forming a half circle. Smoke drifted from campfires. I could see the silver-banded man moving between them, shouting orders. A flag I didn't recognize hung from a pole beside the largest tent. The Apache king signaled for his men to spread out along the ridge. They were ghosts against the rock, waiting, patient. But the raiders below already knew they were coming. They had expected this. I saw Pine tied to a post near the well, bruised and barely standing. 2 men guarded him with rifles ready. My throat tightened. The king motioned for his men to hold. Then he slid off his horse and began walking down the slope alone, unarmed except for a knife at his belt. Every instinct in me screamed to stop him, but I knew he would never turn back. From the ridge, I could hear the distant murmur of voices. The man with the silver band stepped forward, tall and smug, his coat dusted with the red earth of the desert. His voice carried across the valley, smooth and sharp at the same time. "You came, just as we knew you would. You always do." The king said something low that I couldn't catch, but the man laughed, loud and hollow. He gestured toward Pine. "We've been paid well to clean this land, to make it safe for settlers and law. But you and your kind make fine examples when you bleed in the dust." I saw movement in the brush to the north, more riders, hidden, waiting for the signal to attack. My hands tightened on the reins. It wasn't just an ambush for the Apache king. It was meant to start a war. If the tribe struck first, the settlers would have every reason to wipe them out. The king had walked straight into a trap built not for him alone, but for his people's future. I couldn't think. I only knew that if I didn't act, everything would end there. I turned my horse and circled behind the rocks, looking for a way closer to the spring. There was a small gully where the fence had collapsed. I slid from the saddle and crawled through the thorns, the dry earth cutting my palms. The air smelled of metal and smoke. I crept toward Pine's post, staying low. His head lifted weakly when he saw me. His lips moved, forming my name without sound. I shook my head, motioning for silence, and began working on the knots around his wrists. Down below, the silver-banded man kept talking, taunting the king. He was loud, confident, the kind of man who thought words were as powerful as bullets. He bragged about how he had bought land from desperate ranchers, how the new law would soon declare every tribe trespassers. "You'll vanish into the desert," he said, "just ghosts in your own home." The king's answer came quiet and steady. "The desert keeps what belongs to it." Then, without warning, one of the hidden rifles fired. The bullet struck the ground near the king's feet. The trap was sprung. Gunfire roared from both sides, echoing across the cliffs. Horses screamed, men shouted, and smoke filled the air. I pulled Pine free just as a bullet struck the post where he had been tied. We stumbled behind a trough, the dirt spraying around us. He was weak, but his eyes were still sharp. "They knew we'd come," he said between breaths. "They wanted blood." I looked toward the ridge. The Apache warriors had charged down, fierce and fast, moving like shadows through the smoke. The king fought at the front, his knife flashing as he pulled a wounded rider from the line of fire. The man with the silver band had disappeared behind the wagons. I could see settlers and hired guns trying to circle behind the Apache. I knew if they succeeded, the tribe would be caught in the open. I found Pine's knife still tied to his belt and used it to cut through a wagon rope. The horses panicked, bolting and dragging part of the fence down with them. The chaos gave the Apache enough time to regroup. Pine, though weak, took a fallen rifle and began firing toward the far edge of the spring. His hand shook, but his aim was steady. The sound of the shots drew some of the attackers. Attention away from the king. I saw the silver-banded man reappear near the well, a revolver in hand. He aimed at the king, who was kneeling beside a fallen warrior. Without thinking, I picked up a rock and threw it as hard as I could. It struck the fence post near him, making him flinch and fire wide. The bullet hit the wagon instead, setting off one of the oil barrels. The explosion sent a wave of flame across the camp. The noise froze everyone for a heartbeat. The Apache used that moment to push forward. The king's voice rose above the gunfire, sharp and commanding, rallying his men. The raiders began to break, some fleeing toward the canyon, others falling to the ground where they stood. I grabbed Pine's arm and dragged him toward the ridge. My lungs burned, my legs felt heavy, but we didn't stop until we reached the edge of the rocks. Below us, the battle raged on, the smoke turning the sky a strange, burning gold. Then I saw the king fall. It wasn't clear how, just a sudden drop, his hand clutching his side as the silver-banded man stood over him. My heart stopped. I couldn't hear the rest of the world, only the wind rushing in my ears and the pounding of my heart. Pine shouted something, but I was already moving. I slid down the ridge, half running, half falling. My feet hit the ground hard, but I didn't stop. The man with the silver band turned as I reached for a broken spear on the ground. His eyes widened, maybe from surprise that someone like me was standing before him. Shaking, covered in dust, but unafraid, he lifted his revolver. But before he could pull the trigger, a shadow moved behind him, the Apache king, blood running down his arm, but still alive. In a flash, he struck the man's wrist, sending the revolver spinning into the dirt. The man stumbled back, clutching his hand. The king raised his knife, but his strength faltered, and the weapon slipped from his grasp. The silver-banded man lunged forward, and they fell together. Locked in a struggle that churned up the dust around them, I could hear shouts from the ridge as the Apache warriors surged closer, the battle turning in their favor. Yet all I could see was the fight between those two men, the embodiment of two worlds colliding. One built on greed and power, the other on survival and pride. The king's hands closed around the man's arm, forcing him down, inch by inch. The revolver lay a few feet away, glinting in the dirt. I moved toward it, crawling through the dust, my heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear. The man saw me reach for the gun. He kicked free of the king and turned toward me, fury twisting his face. His boot struck the barrel as I grabbed it, sending it spinning just out of reach. His hand wrapped around my wrist, rough and crushing. "You should have stayed sold," he hissed. But before he could lift the weapon again, the king rose behind him, his shadow falling over both of us. Everything paused for a breath, the fire, the smoke, the sound of battle. Even the wind seemed to stop. I could feel the earth beneath me trembling from the weight of what was about to happen. The king's face was pale, his body weak, but his eyes burned with something stronger than pain. He reached down, pulling me to my feet, his hands steady despite the blood. The man turned to strike, and the king's gaze hardened. For a heartbeat, time held still. And then, just as the sun broke through the smoke, the final act began. The sound of the final struggle echoed across the valley. The silver-banded man lunged one last time, desperate and wild, but the Apache king caught his arm, twisting it until the revolver dropped to the ground. The man staggered, his strength finally breaking beneath the weight of his own greed. The king didn't strike again. He simply stepped back, letting the man fall to his knees in the dust. Around them, the fight had ended. The raiders who survived were either fleeing into the desert or dropping their weapons in surrender. The sun broke through the smoke then, painting the valley in soft gold, as if the land itself was tired of blood. I stood there frozen, breathing hard, unable to believe it was over. The wind tugged at my hair, carrying the faint smell of rain. The Apache king swayed on his feet, his wound bleeding through his shirt. I ran to him, catching his arm before he could fall. His eyes met mine, dark and steady, even through the pain. "It is done," he said quietly. His voice trembled but held peace, the kind that comes when a storm has finally passed. I pressed my hand to his wound, my heart pounding. "You saved them," I whispered. He looked toward the horizon where his people were gathering, tending to the wounded and calling for water. "No," he said softly. "We saved each other." The remaining raiders were disarmed and led away under guard. The fence around the spring had been torn down in the battle, and the water flowed freely again. I watched as the tribe worked together, helping the wounded, gathering what could be salvaged. The air that once held fear now carried relief. I saw Pine sitting near the water, his arm wrapped in bandages, smiling weakly as children brought him a drink. When our eyes met, he nodded, his grin faint but alive. The tribe had lost much, but what they had fought for, their freedom, their land. Their unity was still theirs. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the Apache king called his people to gather near the spring. He spoke slowly, his words carrying through the cooling air. He told them that the time of hiding was over, that the land didn't belong to those who built fences and sold promises. It belonged to those who cared for it, who lived with it, not against it. He spoke of peace, but not the kind bought with silence. The kind earned with courage and truth. The people listened, their faces lit by the firelight. When he finished, they raised their hands in respect. Not out of fear, but devotion. Later that night, I sat by the water's edge, the sky full of stars. The spring rippled gently, reflecting the flames from the campfires. The king sat beside me, his shoulder bandaged, his strength slowly returning. He looked older now, the fight having carved deeper lines in his face, yet there was calm in his eyes that I had never seen before. I handed him the carved bone token he had once given me. "You said the wind always returns?" I said quietly. He smiled faintly. "And it brought you back to me." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried enough to make my heart tighten. In the days that followed, the tribe rebuilt their camp near the spring. The fences were taken apart and used to make shelters. The settlers nearby, hearing of what had happened, sent word that they wanted peace. Some came forward to say they had been misled by the man with the silver band, who had promised them riches that never came. Slowly, the lines between the camp and the towns began to soften. Traders returned, but this time they came with respect. The Apache began to trade freely again, sharing goods and stories without fear of betrayal. One morning, as the sun climbed over the hills, a familiar figure appeared on the trailer rider leading a weary mule. It was my father. His face was thinner, his hair grayer, but his eyes were still the same. When he saw me standing by the spring, he stopped, disbelief washing over him. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of years and choices between us. Then he slid from the saddle and walked toward me, his hands shaking. "I thought you were gone," he said, his voice breaking. I wanted to be angry, but the sight of him so small and tired stole the anger away. "You sold me," I said softly. He lowered his head. "I did," he whispered, "because I was weak. Because I thought gold could fix what hunger broke. But I never stopped praying you'd find something better than what I gave you." I told him I had found something better, a life not built on fear, but on strength, trust, and truth. I told him that the people he had once feared had shown me what real honor meant. Tears filled his eyes as he looked around the camp, at the men and women who were now my family. "Then maybe there's hope for me too," he said. The Apache king stepped forward then, his voice steady but kind. "A man's worth is not lost in one mistake," he said. "It is found in what he does after." My father bowed his head, unable to speak. He stayed for a while, helping where he could. The tribe accepted him cautiously, but the days softened their mistrust. He worked quietly, mending fences and repairing tools. And when he smiled again, it was the first time I'd seen him do it without shame. One evening, as we watched the sunset together, he said, "You were right to forgive me. The land forgave me too." He left soon after, returning to rebuild what remained of the old ranch, but he came back often, each time bringing food or supplies, not out of debt, but out of love. Seasons passed. The valley changed, yet it stayed alive. The spring never ran dry again, and the tribes who had once been divided began to meet there for trade and celebration. The story of the battle spread quietly, told around fires and in whispers at trading posts. It became a tale not of war, but of courage, the day when fear met love and lost. I stayed among the Apache, my heart tied to the land that had given me both pain and peace. The Apache king healed slowly, his scar fading but never forgotten. We built a small home near the spring, where the wind carried the sound of water and the songs of children. Sometimes when I looked at him, I could still see the warrior who had once terrified me. But beneath that, I saw the man who had taught me that love could grow even in the harshest soil. We never spoke of the man with the silver band again. His name belonged to the past, buried with the greed that had driven him. Years later, when the rains returned and the valley turned green again, I stood on the same ridge where I had once watched the world fall apart. The horizon stretched endlessly, and the sun poured warmth over everything it touched. The tribe thrived, their children strong, their laughter echoing through the canyon. My father had rebuilt the ranch with help from the Apache, and the land between us was no longer divided by fear, but joined by shared hope. The world wasn't perfect, perhaps it never would, but for the first time, felt fair. When I turned, the Apache king stood beside me, his hair streaked with silver, his eyes still steady and bright. He reached for my hand, and we watched the valley together in silence. The wind moved through the grass like a whisper, soft and endless. "Do you remember the first night you came here?" he asked quietly. I smiled. "I remember being afraid," I said. "But I also remember the sound of drums and the way the stars looked above your camp." He nodded. "The stars still look the same," he said, "because they never judge what changes below." We stood there until the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long. The water at the spring shimmered in the distance, reflecting the orange sky. I thought of everything that had brought me to this moment, the fear, the fire, the loss, and the love that had grown from them all. My life had begun as something taken, but it became something freely given back by the land and the people who lived close to it. As night settled, the drums began again, not for battle, but for celebration. The tribe danced around the fire, their joy reaching into the stars. I watched the children laugh and run, their faces painted with the colors of peace. Beside me, the Apache king watched too, his expression full of quiet pride. When he looked at me, I saw everything we had endured written in his eyes. The storm, the loss, the endless fight for belonging, and beyond it all, I saw peace. He took my hand, warm and steady, and said softly, "The wind brought you here once. Now it will keep you here." And in that moment, surrounded by laughter, light, and the gentle hum of the desert night, I knew it was true. The land had changed us both, not with war or fear, but with love that had survived them. And under the wide American sky, where the stars burned brighter than ever, our story finally found its calm.